Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, it's Dune in June. We're going to be looking at David Lynch's 1984 adaptation of the Frank Herbert science fiction classic. Before we do that, a couple calls to action. This is our maybe one of our favorite calls to action. We have some new reviews on the Apple Podcast Store. We got one from CornChips89 who says 5 stars, good stuff. Always on the lookout for good horror casts that look at movies from an intelligent angle and not just ready to tear every movie to shreds for a flaw or two. And this one does just that. Thanks, guys. Thank you, CornChips89.
Yeah, and by the way, 5 stars on that username.
Fantastic. We also got one from Alibi Shop who says 5 stars, mellow, funny, informative. They say, I don't listen to a lot of review podcasts because so many of them are either no fun unless you have the same taste as the host, or are endlessly jokey hangout shows that take forever to get to any opinions at all. There's a place for both of those, they're just not my thing. Genre Vision almost always manages to stay in that sweet spot where they're hanging out and having fun while having interesting opinions about things, both from a solid general film lover's perspective and as genre-loving non-toxic nerds. Yes! And even when I may not agree, I love hearing how they got there, and I often end up with a list of related things to check out. Beautiful! Like, that is exactly what we're going for here. So thank you so much, Alibi Shop and CornChips89. If you dig what we're doing here, please go to the Apple Podcast Store, drop us a rating and a review. If you do write a review, we will feature it here on the show. And as always, we want to shout out to all of our wonderful Patreon people over at patreon.com/genrevision. If you want to go get access to a whole bunch of bonus material that we make for all the Genre Vision network of shows, go to patreon.com/genrevision. You can become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. You'll get weekly pre-show episodes that we record before Genre Vision. We do some bonus shows, like we're doing our pitch party stuff. I don't know, it's up to like 60, 70 hours or something of bonus material is over there. So if you would like to help out the show that way, patreon.com/genrevision.
And let me tell your ass something. Today's episode is not only brought to you by the people who pay for premium content on Patreon. They literally help fund the show, but today's episode was requested by one of our patrons for a person who is also another patron.
And this is a special birthday present of an episode to one of our wonderful patrons, Andy. So Andy, happy birthday, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. Okay, Dune from 1984.
Fade up on a starscape. Then Virginia Madsen in cinnamon bun hairdo appears.
Oh, I forgot to tell you.
Oh, I forgot to tell you.
We've talked about certain sci-fi movies, like the one that comes to mind is Lost in Space. And this opening is another variation of what they were trying to do in Lost in Space. And it is the Star Wars opening crawl, except nobody can do an opening crawl because you'll immediately be seen as ripping off of Star Wars. So instead, we get in Lost in Space voiceover, or in this, we get Virginia Madsen directly talking to the camera to try and set up the world a bit. And here's the thing. I'm not against this opening in principle because Dune is a very, very complicated world to set up, even in the best of circumstances, and especially to a 1984 mainstream movie-going audience, because Dune is weird.
Dune is extraordinarily complicated. And the basic setup of Dune is like, okay, there is an empire that controls all of everything. This is a far future scenario. So Star Wars is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is a galaxy far, far away, deep into the future. Humans now roam the galaxy. There is a substance that is mined on the planet Arrakis, which is a desert planet that allows for hyperspace travel, basically. It allows the folding of space. So if someone eats enough of this spice, as it's called, it's a drug, their consciousness expands to the point where they can control space-time. And these humans that eat enough of this are called navigators, and they morph into these giant sort of fish-like alien monsters that have to live in a dense gas made out of the spice, and they're basically carted around in giant aquariums. So you get this huge blast of weird right into your fucking face at the beginning of the movie.
And here's the thing, because I'm going to bring up Star Wars maybe a couple times. And when I say Star Wars, I mean 1977 Star Wars, because the success of that film opened up science fiction fantasy genre to the mainstream in a way that had never been done before, or at least on a scale that had never been done before.
Right. The reason movies like The Black Hole happened because of Star Wars.
Every single major motion picture outlet wanted their Star Wars. Like, they wanted their big science fiction fantasy franchise. And by 1984, Dune had been a project that had been attempted previously, most notably under the auspices of director Alejandro Jodorowsky. And that project had fallen through. Also during this period of time, David Lynch had been approached and at one point was somewhat attached to direct the third Star Wars film, Return of the Jedi. Obviously, that didn't happen. And eventually, Lynch finds his way to Dune. It's very clear to me that he has a love and an attraction to genre fiction. And we've covered, like a Blue Velvet on this show. David Lynch attaching himself to Dune actually makes a lot of sense when you consider this very metaphysical and psychedelic element to the story, which you're saying is, tied in with eating the spice melange, extending your consciousness. And there's so many parts of the book that emphasize philosophies that talk about mind over matter and thought over form.
Well, just straight psychedelia. I mean, so much of the experience of the novel is reading about characters' thought processes. They're all playing chess in 4D with one another in their brains all the time.
Right. And so it's actually very easy to me to see why Lynch would be attracted to the story. The problem is that he also is being tasked with making a movie that has to be, in some ways, a mainstream, appealing blockbuster in some mold as Star Wars. And here's the thing. Clearly, David Lynch can't make that movie.
Yeah, I mean, this was a movie that the studio spent over $40 million on in production for 1984. That was big money. Big money then.
This probably nearly killed Dino De Laurentiis.
Yeah.
And famously, a little behind the scenes, like Lynch did not have final cut on the movie, so it was pretty much, taken away from him. It was a troubled production, and it's a movie that to this day has, I think it's fair to say, a mixed legacy as far as its critical and audience reception.
Yeah, at best. So it's easy to see why, just even in the first opening 5 minutes of the movie, why audiences would be turned off Dune. That direct address to camera by Virginia Madsen is really off-putting. And, this is a discussion that you and I had about Lynch in general, in that his management of tone, even like when he has sort of a neutral approach to things, like when he's not trying necessarily to induce anxiety, I think people tend to interpret it as either boring or tense or absurd. And Lynch always sort of occupies this spot in the middle of a Venn diagram of those things. It is anxiety inducing, but also it's sort of slow and there's a distinct absurdity to it. And that persists through all of Dune. Although, Dune is his clear attempt at making a blockbuster that would be appealing to regular people. Clearly, David Lynch is not capable of making that kind of movie. He hasn't attempted to do it since, and for good reason. I mean, I would guess his most mainstream movie is still The Elephant Man, and yes, that it's a prestige drama.
It's that or The Straight Story, which are movies that I think, The Straight Story is a little bit more underground, and I even admit I have not seen it. But that is a very kind of like straightforward and warm, comfortable, dramatic experience. And The Elephant Man is, as far as the narrative, very accessible. Dune has this problem as a movie in that, especially at the time it was released, in that it wants to be a big sci-fi spectacle. Everybody wanted to be a big sci-fi spectacle. They made a goddamn Flash Gordon movie attempting to,
capitalize
ride
on that,
ride the coattails of Star Wars. But it's very clear to me that I don't know how interested Lynch is in the spectacle aspect as much as he is the world building, because in this opening sequence in which we meet the Emperor of the known universe,
the Padishah Emperor Shaddam the Fourth.
Yes, and the guild navigator appears, and these people that look like the strangers from Dark City who have to speak into a weird radio microphone thing that looks like it's been reconfigured from something from the 30s to translate. And then this giant alien testicle comes in a tank. It is so clear to me that there is a vision here that is both being fed by the source material and as a piece of interpretation. And I think that, along with the metaphysical and psychedelic aspects, which we'll get to, is clearly what interested Lynch, because from a production standpoint, Dune is something of a triumph.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is, I rarely ever use words like rococo, but I mean, like, you can't avoid it, when you're talking about the kind of production design this is. I mean, it's overdone to the point of being rococo or, Baroque. I mean, it's hideous, but it's also just astonishingly beautiful.
It's unique.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the reasons Star Wars worked so well was so much of its presentation never really felt alien to people.
No, it was tangible human stuff.
Well, right. I mean, even the first shot of Star Wars after the crawl is the tiny rebel ship and then the giant Imperial ship. Just that alone communicates understandable language to an audience. This opening is trying to do exposition, which we're also going to, like, this is the thing. The first 20 minutes or so of Dune is pretty much just exposition. We actually skipped after Virginia Madsen talks directly to the audience to set things up. Then we get a star map thing that's like, okay, here's all the planets you need to know. Here's the relationships. Here's the families that rule these individual planets. It's a lot of info for an audience to get into right out the gate.
It's total overload. And because I read the novel recently enough, and I feel like I got a pretty good grasp on the way Herbert set it up, I was like, yes, I know all these things, but I had to kind of put on my first-time audience member glasses and think, if I were a first-time, audience member seeing this with no prior knowledge of what, Frank Herbert had wrote, or had written, rather. Sorry, I'm 2 years in. Grammar's not quite my strong suit at the moment. I would have to imagine it would be complete and utter overload. I mean, this is not information that's being delivered to us in a way that would be organic. I mean, this is all very, very didactic, right to the audience. And you can think like, yeah, this is what maybe Paul Atreides' perspective is, and that this is the way he learns about these things, but it's not really framed in that kind of way. It's just bald exposition right to the audience. And there's just so much of that throughout this movie that I can't help but wonder, like, was this what did it? Yeah, probably.
Well, there's another tool that comes into play in that regard, and that is there is a lot of character internal voiceover going on in this movie. And I'm sure coming from the source material, that is how that book is structured. Is always like jumping into the huge cast of characters that are in the movie. It's jumping into all their heads all the time.
Yes.
And it seems that the decision was the best way to communicate these things was to make it literal. We are hearing their thoughts.
The trouble with adapting fiction, particularly fiction like Dune, is trying to make the internal into something external, because live action film isn't really suited for allowing us into the internal thought processes of the characters, at least not in the way that's done in prose. Mm-hmm. I was talking with somebody about the adaptation of Misery recently, and they had said something about either the stage adaptation or the movie adaptation not being as accurate to the novel as it could be. But the truth is, like, so much of that novel is just the main character's thought process as he sits in a bed. And I'm like, what do you want to do? You just want to sit on a shot of the character in the bed thinking for 2 hours? Like, that's, you got to take the internal thought process of the character and externalize it somehow. But Lynch wants to actually have that thought process, that sort of prosaic thought process of people turning feelings into words. He wants to make that external by just having it be voiceover. Like, it's a close up of them and you just hear their, disembodied voice in a sort of a reverby effect. It's quite a choice. I can definitely tell that this was not a choice to try and fix something after the fact. I can tell that this was written into the fabric of the movie, and like the movie working was sort of dependent upon that even in the writing stages.
It must be that there's just so much of it, and so much of the cinematic setup of shots doesn't feel like, it feels like I know that in this moment we're focusing on this character. They're not speaking on camera because we're going to have voiceover. That happens a ton in the movie. And sometimes I think it's very jarring because you may have a character that only we hear their voiceover once.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I'm not saying that voiceover in of itself is a bad tool.
It's not.
But Dune overuses it to an extent that I think its intention was clearly to get us closer to the characters by being in their thoughts. But I think it has the opposite effect and actually distances us from them as fully formed characters and humans, because we would rather be seeing them either outright speaking this to other characters and forming relationships and stuff like that, or taking action.
Or we could see it in their expressions. We could see it in their, the actors being allowed to emote. The trouble is with this particular property, so much of the characterization is based in like stoicism. Like all of the Atreides characters are very sort of, corseted into their, into their sort of stoic states. They're not allowed to let their emotions slip out. They're all very stoic and having very serious conversations. They're all very logical, very analytical, very Spock. The Bene Gesserit are very calculating. The Padishah Emperor is all business. The Harkonnens are all like pure evil, but they're all scheming. So there's this logic to their scheming. I actually think that's the element that Lynch handles the best because he takes a lot of liberty with it. But
we're gonna get to it. But let's talk about casting, because we're talking about characters, and I'll say this: I would say that the majority of the casting in Dune is good casting.
Yeah, I like most of the people they chose for these roles. Dune is an extremely white movie. That's not an insult. It's just a matter of fact. It's just a whole lot of white folks standing around. And Herbert doesn't ever really get into that. But also I think Lynch's whole body of work, there's a distinct white, Lynchian whiteness. He tells stories about, this kind of particular type of whiteness, and it's not an insult to say that his storytelling feels very white.
He's certainly not against criticizing or looking at the darker parts of that. I mean, Blue Velvet is certainly looking at the lie of white suburbia.
Exactly. He's saying there's something totally rotten in white suburbia. So Herbert's ideas about what the future would be like and sort of what people would be like, he kind of stays away from race.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Even though this takes place in the year 10,191, it has more of that return to a very clear feudal system. I mean, these are royal houses that are feuding with each other. This is War of the Roses. This is Game of Thrones. This kind of stuff.
Yep.
The sci-fi aspects aren't really, I think, what's on the movie's mind or the source material's mind. There are things about that we'll get into, but the movie, I think it succeeds texturally because we see all these different planets. We spend time at the Atreides. They're going to eventually take over control of the planet Arrakis, Dune, from the Harkonnens, and we see that they live on this lush, ocean-filled planet, and everything in their place is very, stone and granite and cold, and
it's actually the most sort of Giger design in the thing. Like everything the Atreides have on Caladan is like the biggest influence from Giger.
I don't know about that, because the big influence from Giger is when we hop over to Gidi Prime, the planet of the Harkonnens, and the first thing we see is just this giant statue in shadow that looks to be like a a fat person's face with their mouth open.
It's a mouth belching out smoke. Yeah.
Like whatever it is so surreal. And here is where I think Dune knocks it out of the park. Everything with the Harkonnens and Baron Harkonnen and their world fucking rules in terms of establishing through pure visual language that these Harkonnens are horrible villains.
Well, and this is when Lynch does away with this sort of stoicism. Like all the rest of the characters are just so fucking stoic and they don't emote, but the Harkonnens aren't afraid of that. And so they're not afraid to like get arch. Lynch isn't afraid to basically say like these people are sincerely evil. He's not trying to play coy. I mean, he's really just basically trying to say like the Harkonnens are utterly monstrous, and the sort of details he invents to tell you that they're monstrous. Like, when the Baron Harkonnen decides he's going to, launch this evil plot against the House Atreides, he has this young man brought in who has this bizarre, like reverse mohawk haircut and has also like some sort of, plug in his chest. But he gets under a shower of like black goo, and the black goo is raining down on his face. Ah!
And the music at this moment by Toto fucking is awesome. It's all this creepy, like
very good. It's very like Bach toccata.
It's super gothic. But even before this, to establish visually that Baron Harkonnen is the ultimate evil, he is being attended to by these attendants who have like weird fly goggles and their ears have been sewn shut, and he has all these disgusting boils on his face that are getting drained.
It's all very Gilliam, actually.
Yeah, it's wonderful. But then he floats over in his giant flying suit, gets an oil bath, and then goes over to this young attendant who was like taking care of some flowers, and just like, there's no other way to say this. He basically like molests him and then yanks out his heart plug, and this blood just starts spewing out of him.
Well, I mean, Baron Harkonnen in the book is a pedophile.
Oh, I forgot that.
He actually at one point in the book distinctly requests a boy who looks like Paul Atreides that he can assault and molest. It's gross.
Well, and I will say Kenneth McMillan as Baron Harkonnen, Vladimir Harkonnen, he runs away with the movie. And granted, it is because, like you're saying, the majority of the other characters are written to be stoic and heroic and, all of this. He is the one that gets to just go for broke. Every line I think it's a little bit like Eddie Redmayne in Jupiter Ascending, where he's either whispering or yelling every line. And it's kind of wonderful.
Yeah, I can't deny that his performance is the big one that swings hardest and connects with the ball most of the time. And, I think Kyle MacLachlan as the young Paul Atreides, the sort of, hero of the story, the eventual messiah of Dune, he's fine. I mean, he's a hell of a lot better in Blue Velvet, but that's because I feel like he's a very, very good actor, and the material was there to support him in Blue Velvet, and it wasn't quite there to support him here.
He's given more variety to play. Again, Paul just has to be this stoic hero. And I think he's great as it is in the story, where Paul is supposed to be this boy who, this is his journey through manhood. And I will say one of my other favorite moments that's from the book and is one of the more famous things from Dune is when he is being tested by the Bene Gesserit mother, who's this, this basically a religious group, and she's their leader. And she's testing him, and she makes him put his hand in a box and tells him that he's going to feel all this pain. And if he removes his hand from the box, she's going to stab him in the neck with this little needle called the Gom Jabbar that will kill him. And in this, there's the very famous mantra that I believe that is from the book, which is, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death, and all that. And
I got to say, Lynch is way bigger on mantras than Herbert was. So
okay,
this sort of like repeating poetic stuff, like Lynch enforces that way more heavily in the movie.
I'm sure those things are somewhat pulled from. I've not read the book since over a decade, but I'm sure those are seeds in there. But like you say, there's so many things that are repeated. We hear the sleeper must awaken.
Yes,
there is the mentats that we see. We get to see Brad Dourif, who shows up and they have to drink this juice that also expands their minds, and he has, it's like is by will I set my mind in motion, and and he says that mantra once or twice over. And I like that. I think that is one of the best ways to bring sort of the ideas of characters in Dune having like codes and everything and externalizing them instead of just having to hear their thoughts. It's like, yeah, a mantra, I get it.
Yeah, but something that's also, crucial to know is like David Lynch is he's big into transcendental meditation, which is about repetition of a mantra in your mind. And so these sorts of influences will work their way into his fiction. I mean, it's pretty obvious that he gets a lot of his sort of imagery and his ideas from, achieving that sort of flow state through meditation. It's why so many of his movies are dreamlike. It's just this sort of almost nonsensical flow of images. And here he's trying to make sense of a story that is so incredibly complicated. But I think the large effect of it is that there has to be so much taken out that it feels nonsensical. I mean, there are so many characters in this movie that didn't need to be there. There are certain elements that are excised from the film that I don't miss at all. Like, Paul is not only trained in combat like we see in the movie, but he's also sort of this interesting blend between masculine and feminine in the book, where he's trained as a Bene Gesserit by his mother and the other Bene Gesserit, witches, quote unquote, but he's also trained as a mentat. And this is all stuff that I feel like Lynch would have been better off getting into, rather than things like, oh, we have to have Gurney Halleck, carry around his musical instrument for one scene, only to say no music.
Which I love. That's just a very specific thing, because in the credits they note like Gurney's whatever that instrument's called,
balisette, I think it is.
Yeah, and it's just like it is in one scene and is not even utilized, and they spent way too much money on that thing for the no time it's given. But
or like Duncan, Idaho has like what, 3 or 4 scenes, only 2 of them in which he has dialogue.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, a lot of characters that could have been shut down completely. I think one of the biggest failings of the movie for a mainstream audience is they expect this to be a sci-fi action movie. And I don't think Lynch was ever going to be a particularly good action director. And when we were watching it, there's big scenes of, troopers, the Sardaukar troopers, like killing people. And eventually towards the end where the Fremen, who we'll get to, we promise, are mounting their attack and everything. And you said all of the action in this just looks like second unit, ho-hum, boring stuff. And
right.
And
you extras in those costumes move over here, and then we're going to light that fire off over there. And then these extras in these costumes are going to move over there. And then there's going to be explosion there. It's very ho-hum. Like, I don't care. The most interesting action stuff comes really early on in the movie. And that's when Paul is fighting the training robot.
Yeah. Training robot's cool. There's a shield fight between Paul and Gurney, who's played by the wonderful Patrick Stewart.
Yeah.
This effect never looked good, but I'm okay if it came back up in the movie.
Right. The shields aren't technically ever really important in the movie. In the book, they serve an important function of like informing how combat works.
Right.
Because if you shoot somebody with a laser blaster, what they call a laser gun in the book, if you shoot somebody who's wearing a shield with a laser gun, there's a fucking huge explosion. So you can't really do it in combat without damaging, potentially yourself. So there's a lot of this idea of like hand-to-hand combat is what will win the battles. And so they get into what's called the weirding way, which in Lynch's Dune is changed completely. And it's more along his lines of like, the power of words and meditation and psychedelia.
Right. So eventually we do get to Dune, and the Atreides are there, and they're learning to cooperate with the Fremen to take over spice mining and everything. And I think I like Dune quite a bit, the film, the late Lynch film, but I do think it has a fatal failing. And that is where it comes to the Fremen. The Fremen are the big motivating element in the story. They are the group of people that Paul will eventually go and join. He will become their messiah. He will learn their culture, all of this kind of stuff. And I think the Fremen get the short shrift in the final cut version of Lynch's Dune.
Right. Their culture, which is actually vital to Paul's sort of rebirth as hero, is really, yeah, like you said, given the short shrift. They are basically just like blue-eyed people that live in the desert in this one, and really it's about their philosophy on how to live and why they live in such a harsh climate. That actually informs Paul's ascension to what is basically godhood.
Well, and there's certainly religion is a big factor in Dune. I think, and I don't remember the source material well enough, but I think it's vital that there are multiple types of religion presented in the movie, and even the Harkonnens, who seem to be completely non-religious figures, they only believe in themselves. I like that there are differing viewpoints on religions and belief systems inherent in the source material, and that it is there in the film, but I don't think they ever get the dissection and focus that they deserve, either the Bene Gesserit stuff or the Fremen stuff.
Yeah.
But it's fundamentally interesting, and there's stuff in the movie that's interesting. And again, I'll keep coming back to the production stuff. I think there is really big, impressive, cool production stuff in Dune, most notably the sandworms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the worms built by Carlo Rambaldi, who you might know as the guy who built E.T. and, the alien from Alien. He did all the mechanical effects inside, the rubber skins and things like that Giger actually painted by hand. But, Rambaldi built these worms in miniature, and they never look anything less than incredible. And the way that they actually managed to get the fine powder for these miniature shots as the worms rise up out of the fine powder, and you see it sort of blowing off them and lifting off them, and the sort of, three-lobed mouth opening up, like, this shit is just awesome. It's fucking cool as hell.
It's definitely one of the best, I think, executions of the movie. Is like they got the sandworms right. I even like that they are slowly revealed. As the first time we get to see one, we don't really see the entire worm. We just see the little, spice mining vehicle that the worm is going to attack. And we get a nice little cameo from David Lynch, like, she's not going to take it. Whatever he says. But the
temperature is 71 degrees,
16 Celsius. But when they're evacuating this thing and they're up on, whatever the flying vehicle that they're in is called, they look down and they see underneath the spice mining vehicle just the aperture of the worm's mouth coming up from under the sand. And it's just like, yeah, I buy the scale of these things. I buy the power. It's wonderful. The worm stuff, every time that stuff would kind of take center stage, I was clicked in. Even if I wasn't clicked in with narrative or character stuff or anything, I was like, oh no, the worm's back. I'm in.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much here that, focuses on the internal experiences of the characters and does so in a way that audience members really aren't used to. Like, to be able to hear their thoughts directly as if we share a telepathic link with these characters is it's just not usual. And there's so much on a grand scale here that is about the politics and sort of the implications of what's going on here. The book obviously has all this time to get into colonialism. Like, what does it mean for this new ruling family, that the emperor assigns to this planet? And it's like, well, are the Fremen the natives of Arrakis? Well, like, no, they colonized the planet, but they also found a way to sort of live in sync with the planet. And, there's all these different philosophies. Like, the Fremen in the book talk endlessly about how to manage water and, coming down to, moisture. Like, crying is looked down upon because you're giving your water to the dead. It's all this sort of cultural stuff, all these beautiful cultural details that I think could have made their way into something like this, but either Lynch didn't want to focus on them or they just ended up not making the cut.
Yeah, that's my biggest problem now, because I saw this movie before I ever read the book, and I always had a fascination and a like with it, but I always remembered the back half or so being like, yeah, I don't remember a lot of that. I remember all the first half, but like before they get to Dune and establishing everything, I'm like, I remember a lot of that. Yeah. And when, the grand plan is kind of revealed that, oh, the setup is to get the Atreides there and then kill off their house basically and destroy them, and then the Harkonnens will take over again at the behest of the Emperor.
Yeah.
Like when all that's happening, there's cool stuff like Jürgen Prochnow, who plays the Duke Leto Atreides, Paul's father, gets a poison tooth from Dean Stockwell that he gets to spray into Brad Dourif's face.
I mean, it really does sound like a dream that you had.
Yes, and that stuff is all stuff that I deeply remembered when we were doing this watch of it. But once all that occurs and Paul escapes and has to go live with the Fremen, I think the movie takes a serious downturn simply because it feels like so much character is missing. And I think that's a problem with the movie overall, is Dune is not a movie with a clear beating heart.
It isn't. There are attempts at basically outlining, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in the movie. The movie makes it extraordinarily apparent that the Harkonnens are the bad guys. Ripping out people's hearts and showering in black goo and having huge ugly pustules on your face and bad teeth. Like it's immediately apparent that these people are the evil ones.
What I like though is that they balance that ugliness with attractiveness by having Sting come out in a little metal bluefinned Speedo. And it's like, oh yeah, they're not all, just, it's like, oh, here's our hot Fade Routha.
He is very pretty. But I mean, you also know that like, he's in league with the awful Harkonnens, and he enjoys the bloodshed and the cruelty just as much.
Sting doesn't. We got to talk about Sting real quick, but Sting doesn't get as many big arch lines, but cut to his face, he's good for reaction shots.
Oh yeah. Cut to his reaction shots. He's always got some big goofy evil grin on.
Wonderful.
The eyebrows fully raised. It's awesome. And then they'll do stuff like they'll give the Atreides family a pug to humanize them right. And to let you know, like, oh, these are the good guys. They love their dog.
Yeah.
Right.
Movie shorthands. It's like they got a pug, and even when they're being raided, there's a shot where just the pug is running down a hallway. It's like, oh no, yeah. That's the character I care about the most. And
Benji, come back.
And it's a bummer because there are definitely moments like when Leto is poisoned and Dr. Yui, played by Dean Stockwell, tells him, it's like, okay, you're going to get close to the Baron. I'm going to give you this poison tooth and all of this. It's like, yeah, you can have characters interact with each other and state things bluntly, and it works better. But the movie doesn't earn a lot of perspective from its enormous ensemble. Like it's very, very poor, I think, at getting the audience into particular characters' head spaces. And I think that's what ends up kind of poisoning its attempt at any kind of heart, because later Paul falls in love with Sean Young, who maybe has 5 lines in the movie. She's incredibly ancillary, and it's just like, yeah, they fall in love and nothing. There is absolutely nothing to that romance.
Zero chemistry. It's totally forced. There is some stuff before Paul meets her. Like he has premonitions of meeting her.
Right.
And the premonition stuff, it doesn't really work all that well. Like the premonitions are loaded with dreamlike imagery that Lynch, I think, kind of came up with, not entirely on his own, but there's stuff like, Paul decides to call himself Paul Muad'Dib because there is a crater on the second moon of Arrakis that looks like a desert mouse, which the Fremen call Muad'Dib. And it's like, that detail is like, why do you need to hammer home the second moon, the second moon, the second moon 3 or 4 times in visions? It's like, it doesn't matter. There are so many more important details that could have made the cut.
My problem with the vision stuff is that for being the factor that I think would be most attractive to Lynch, the psychedelia and the metaphysical and stuff, there's not much in those visions that feel very, like, it actually feels really freshman level surreal. Like you just have a floating hand.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes the psychedelia stuff is genuinely disturbing. Like the image of the fetus floating in like the weird bloody pool, and it floats upward and outward, and that's supposed to represent Paul's sister in utero.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very cool and gross. I'll give it that. But I just don't think it nails that element, which is one of the things that interests me the most about Dune as a story. It's like, yeah, it's a white savior sci-fi action movie, but there's this other layer of the mental and the transcendental that separates Dune from a lot of other fiction that I think is really unique. And certainly I'm sure that was influenced by the prevalence of psychedelic drugs in the time that Dune was written. And the idea of it as being like this, not being recreational, is something that is literally expanding your mind into a greater form of consciousness. And that stuff is here in Dune, but it's never given the best weight, and it's not backed up by characters that earn any kind of endearment from us.
The movie doesn't really do the proper legwork for characters to become likable. And I know a character doesn't necessarily have to be likable to even be a good protagonist, but to be able to relate to a character on their basic emotional level is, I think, crucial to tell an effective story, if it's going to be popular cinema. And the fact that the movie kind of bungles those sort of simple emotional beats or really doesn't have interest in portraying them in normal ways is, I think, a shortcoming. There's one moment I think that kind of sums up my feeling of why the voiceover so often doesn't work, and why it distances us from the characters. And that's in the little ship on the surface of Arrakis. There is a close-up on Max von Sydow's character, and he's thinking about this new leadership on Arrakis. He's thinking to himself through the voiceover, I think I like this new Duke. And that could have just easily been said in just a shot of Max von Sydow looking over at the Duke. We see the shot of the Duke doing something that, Max von Sydow's character would like. You cut back to Max von Sydow's character and he smiles and he kind of nods. It's like, okay, we get that, and we're sort of led into the character's emotions a little bit. We get that warmth, that humanity, that immediacy, instead of, I'm beginning to like this new Duke.
Well, there is a severe dearth of interpersonality in Dune. Like, I mean, he could literally say that line to the Duke. Like, I think I like you. Like that's it. So it's like, oh, there is now an establishment of relationship between these characters.
Yeah.
And it's why like moments like Patrick Stewart's character Gurney, who we think possibly dies when the Harkonnens come back and retake Arrakis, Paul eventually finds him in the desert again and is just like, oh, and of course Patrick Stewart is just, he can't help but be a great actor in this moment where he's just like, you young pup. But there is no weight to that moment because it's like, they even had interpersonal stuff and it didn't really click in a compelling way.
Yeah, I mean, you get one significant scene between the two of them early on, and he just walks in with this guitar-looking thing over his shoulder and goes, no music.
But there's so much to like about Dune on the surface. When we were watching it, I just couldn't help but be like, the costuming, the sets, the beautiful sets. Like, there are some drop-dead enormous sets in this movie.
They're fucking incredible. The costumes, urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads.
Yes, and the
still suits.
The still suits look good.
They're just they're fucking great.
They're cool.
Yeah, they're really cool.
All of the production stuff, everything about that, I think is a home run for Dune, and is probably part of the reason why it has been able to maintain a cult following. I mean, obviously the attachment of Lynch as a cult director and everything helps, but I think it's because the texture of Dune 1984 is appropriately rich and it stands out amongst the crowd. But upon this revisit, this has got to be the first time I've watched this movie in probably 10 years.
Yeah, same here.
I think I realize it's like, yeah, there is a detachment and maybe that is present in the stoicism of the source material. I don't recall enough of my feelings about that in particular with the book. I
mean, the characters are stoic, but you have a direct line into their heads. So you know how they're feeling. You just know they're having to contain it.
Right. So I think the movie drops the ball on so many levels with that stuff. And it's unfortunate because the potential's there. The cast is good. I think the cast is really good at some points.
Sure, yeah.
I think the movie is a victim of its burden by the greatness of its source material, not in terms of greatness of quality, but pure size. Like we said, tons of characters in this version, in this iteration, should have been cut and not in the movie at all. I think at the end of the day, Dune is a failure, but it's a damn impressive movie for being a failure.
Oh yeah, it's not some dinky little disappointment of a movie. It is really extravagant, and I admire it for its extravagance, and I admire it for its outright weirdness. I mean, it's David Lynch, so there's something to appreciate there about it. So, thanks, Lynch.
I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but I will say this. The weirdness is one of the things I'm hesitant about the new Denis Villeneuve version with. I mean, obviously we've only gotten small looks at it, but the approach to style and everything, it makes me wonder how weird that potential second movie is going to go, because it's in the back half where you get all this psychedelia and tripping out, and you know, Paul is becoming the Kwisatz Haderach super being and going to a metaphysical place in time and space where women can't go, and like all this crazy LSD induced shit. And I look at Villeneuve's stills and stuff, I'm like, okay, well that's the first half of that story where it's all the establishing the regal houses and the political system and the...
Well, it's lots of people standing around in sort of, you know, big chunky spacesuits and
big chunky
like
gray spacesuits.
Desaturated landscapes, and I'm just like, where's the cool? This is like trying to be serious, and I'm like,
Where's Paul drinking the vomited death water of a worm baby in order to, you know, transcend to a higher consciousness?
Yeah, that may not be until the second film, if that ever gets made. But
right,
the whole idea behind Dune is that it's extraordinarily dweeby. I mean, like a really, truly, deeply nerdy story. And to make it cool in a way that popular audiences will understand it as cinema, ooh, that's a tough job. And Lynch wasn't able to do it because, well, I really don't know if anybody can.
Well, here's the thing. Dune is not a fun sci-fi story. And it's not to say that there isn't fun elements in the movie, the 1984 movie, but at its core, it is a very, very serious, deeply thought out, you know, it's considered by a lot of people the equivalent of what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy. And
yeah, or it really feels more like Game of Thrones, where it is about sort of the dissolution of a shogunate, you know, where you have this feudal system across the galaxy that you know, is built upon one particular industry. And you have one person who wants to hold that industry hostage or potentially destroy it to disrupt the entire political system. And it plays with the idea of there are no, you know, it's really cliche to say that it's like morally gray, there's no good guys and there's no bad guys, but that really is what comes across in Frank Herbert's whole thing. You know, Paul Atreides goes into this life of his, you know, he understands that it's all this sort of like big string of dominoes, that as soon as he does this in order to sort of, you know, right things in the galaxy, he knows things are going to go haywire, but he also feels that he won't be able to stop it no matter what. Like that's the curse of his sort of, you know, awakening to godhood and sentience. Like this is just what is destined to happen from this point.
Well, and I think that's another failing of the movie, is that the journey, the Messiah journey that Paul has in this version, it doesn't take advantage of the complexities of that. I being raised as a Christian and not a practicing one in any means now, I still find value in certain elements of the story of Christ. And one of the greatest pieces of that story is when Christ goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and prays to God and says, like, if you can get me out of this, do it. Like, I don't want to die. And it's a wonderful human moment of a character that realizes that I'm going to die for something greater than myself that is out of my control, but that's not what I want. Like, I'm not resigned to it. Mm-hmm. And I remember that certainly being some factor in the source material, that Paul is ascending to this godhood and is becoming the figurehead of a jihad, which is spoken, that word is spoken in the movie, will not be in the Villeneuve version, I assure you.
Yeah, and it's said innumerable times in the novel. I mean, just jihad this, jihad that. I mean, it's a galaxy-wide jihad, you know, that is inspired by the fervor for Paul Muad'Dib.
You get it? everybody. But, you know, the fact that Paul's journey in the movie doesn't really grapple with his ascendance to godhood, that, you know, his big, I love the moment just as pure fun in which he yells, "Father, the sleeper has awakened."
Sure.
But
and these are things that like movie characters yell, like the pain,
yes.
or no,
yes.
or Father.
Yes, I love all that.
It's all stuff you can imagine coming out of Matt Berry's mouth, you know.
Yes, I just think of all the screaming at the sky shots in X-Men Origins Wolverine. But yeah, I think that in trying to make something that could be palatable to all audiences in 1984, David Lynch's Dune was kind of stuck in an impossible space, because you can't really do that in 1984. Now in 2020, I think you can do it for a very certain collective of cinema goers, and that this will come across as the kind of Nolan cool, stoic bro hero.
But I also have to hand it to the Marvel Cinematic Universe for introducing people to sort of huge galaxy spanning, you know, science fiction stories with characters that can see innumerable futures. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, different factions in the galaxy, and understanding the sort of, you know, workings of certain of groups and their scheming across different movies and different stories. Like, you know, I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe has actually introduced people to this kind of storytelling, and also Game of Thrones being the cultural sensation that it was. Like, people can get into the political intrigue of this now. People can understand the intricacies.
And I think that's why the first movie will probably be very Game of Thrones, focused on the royal intrigue and the fall of this great house. You know, the Atreides are going to definitely be Starkified.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And if that works, that's cool. I'm not saying that can't work, and I'm not saying I'm not interested in it, but the weirdness of Dune, which is present in Lynch's version, even though it may not succeed at all of that, is what I think keeps this particular sci-fi world interesting. As its own individual movie, I think Dune is fine, which is a bummer, because the things about it that are great are so great. But I think its biggest failure is that it doesn't work as pure human drama.
Yeah, I mean, and Lynch has this very different understanding of what human drama is, and that's one of the things that sets his filmography apart from literally anyone else. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you have to give it to Lynch for having, you know, there's a reason we have an adjective just for him. It's Lynchian. He doesn't do what anybody else does. He's singular as an artist, but it doesn't suit Dune in the way that it would need to for it to be a popular science fiction blockbuster film.
Well, I think we've said all we can say about David Lynch's Dune at this point. Just do want to reiterate, those worms are awesome.
They are indeed awesome. Thank you, Carlo Rambaldi.
But
hey, they spent an entire year designing the new ones for the Villeneuve film.
Yeah, whatever. Let's head over to the shelf, where we pick some movies that might act as good pairings or substitutes for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to genrevision.com, comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks, and we'll feature them in next week's episode. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for David Lynch's Dune?
For another surreal, almost nonsensical science fiction dystopian future weirdness movie, I don't think you need to look any further than Zardoz, that I think is actually way more successful at being a nonsensical science fiction film, you know, with actors that you know, popular science fiction, you know, audience members would recognize. You know, it's kind of a must-see.
Yeah, go listen to our Zardoz episode. There is a time before you've seen Zardoz and a time after. It's one of those kind of movies.
I mean, Zardoz has such a bluntness to it that I admire. And it's also so strangely horny.
Yeah, Borman just goes for everything. He has no concern of this being palatable at all.
Well, it's so much more connected to like ugly, stinky, hairy humanity than Dune is. Like, Dune is so far detached from that stuff, but Zardoz is very like Zardoz has BO, but it's kind of a fascinating BO funk that you're like,
Yeah, it's
ooh, okay.
It's got its own particular musk.
That's one way of putting it. Anyway, what, sir, are you pulling off the shelf this week?
Well, I think another incredible big budget sci-fi production that absolutely sings as a piece of production but has a heart problem is Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, a movie that is a deserved classic. And I like Blade Runner. I never really have the inkling to watch Blade Runner a lot because I think it has one element in it where I think its heart works, and that is in the character and presentation of Roy Batty as played by the late, great Rutger Hauer. Roy Batty is the real protagonist of the movie. In my mind, he's the antagonist, but he is by far the compelling character that I want to follow.
I still cannot believe Rutger Hauer is gone.
Yeah, it's a damn shame. Because watching him in that, it's so clear that is where the movie shines and has some sense of heart. But following around Harrison Ford's Rick Deckard, and he's also, Sean Young just keeps getting in these big budget sci-fi movies where her romances never click. I feel bad for her.
Poor Sean Young, yeah.
And that is widely criticized as, Ford and Young having issues on set and then, all this. I will recommend the Charles de Laurizica fantastic documentary, Dangerous Days. I've watched that documentary more than I've watched Blade Runner.
It's Charles de Laurizica, man. That guy fucking makes a documentary like nobody's business.
It's him and was it Laurent Bouzereau, who they kill those film documentaries. So like Blade Runner is a fascinating production, and as a piece of sci-fi world building production art, it is nigh flawless. It's game changing in the extreme. But I think that within that, it loses some heart, a lot like Dune. It doesn't tell the best human drama that it could. And the one strong piece of drama that it comes from is the one character that is, arguably not human. So Blade Runner, it's one that I know has a deserved following and should be looked at as both a classic in film and in the genre. But that doesn't mean it's a perfect movie.
No, actually the sequel might be better.
It's true. Go listen to our Blade Runner 2049 episode. Well, let's head over to the listener shelf from last week's episode on Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. Mr. Milksteak recommended Full Eclipse from 1993, starring Mario Van Peebles, which I believe is a werewolf cop movie before Wolf Cop. And also Starry Eyes, a movie that we've certainly recommended on this show a couple of times. Eric Fuchs went with the original The Howling, directed by Joe Dante. Can't go wrong there. JT's shelf pick was Piranha 2, The Spawning. And I'm just going to say, JT, keep your ears open. And Stephen Nesbello went with Howling 3, The Marsupials, which, it's not bad. I liked it. It's certainly better than Howling 2, but that doesn't take much.
Whenever somebody says The Marsupials, I just think, The Aristocrats.
You got to do the snap.
Yeah.
So as always, thank you all so much for the shelf picks. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
I've been pumping something into my ears more than anything else this week, and that is the new album from Run the Jewels. That is the pairing of rapper Killer Mike with rapper producer LP. And they decided to release the album a little bit early, considering what's been going on. We are now entering our second week of widespread protests and near open revolt in this country because police keep murdering innocent black people and unarmed black people in this country. And this album is an extraordinarily political album, more so than any other Run the Jewels release before it. And it's actually helped me process a lot of my anger over this situation. And it's been helpful for me to hear the perspectives of these two artists and the artists that they bring on to guest on the album. Zach De La Rocha, who you might recognize as the front man of Rage Against the Machine, is back to guest on this album after being on Run the Jewels 2. But also they bring on rappers like 2 Chainz. Pharrell Williams is on there. He's on the best track on the album is called Just. And both Pharrell and Zach De La Rocha are guesting on that track. And it is searing. I mean, this is the kind of political commentary married with like incredible technical skill in musicianship in this album. It is not just incredibly timely and perfect for right now, but it's got the power to last because it's that good. Great record, and I'd recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a listen before the week is up. Well, on my end, I wanted to seek out some genre films from Black filmmakers, and there's been one that's been on my list, I think, since last year when it was talked about on the documentary Horror Noir, The History of Black Horror. This is Eve's Bayou from 1997, written and directed by Casey Lemons.
Is it Casey or Cassie?
Casey Cassie. I'm sorry if I, didn't say that right, but this is a movie that it was, I think, particularly focused on by Tananarive Due. And it's one that she says that she gets pushback on, saying is a horror movie. And that always intrigues me because I'm the kind of guy that's like, everything is horror until you make the case strongly enough that it's not. And even then I'll probably still say it's horror. So I always wanted to check this out because I'm like, yeah, I remember seeing that box art in the video store, but I know nothing about it. And I told you, it was like, this has got kind of big Stephen King energy for a story. It's all told as kind of a large flashback about a summer from the perspective of the character Eve, who at the time is, I think 12 years old. It's the debut performance of Journey's, I believe it's Smollett Bell. She is phenomenal for such a young actress. Like it's stunning to see a child actor be able to carry the weight of this story, which I can't remember exactly what era. It kind of takes place in that, like, it's just sometime in the 50s or, it just has that kind of nebulous past. I don't know if they ever say what the year is. And Eve is a character that at a party witnesses her father, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who also is a producer of the movie, potentially being intimate with a woman that's not his wife. We see the movie mostly through her perspective. She has an aunt who is gifted with some kind of psychic visions, and it's implied that Eve also has this ability. And she starts to kind of see her father in a different way. He's the small town doctor, and he's always out, going to patients' places, and sometimes he'll take Eve with him. And she's starting to wonder, like, is my dad sleeping around a lot? And then there's another element of the movie where is he having an inappropriate relation with one of his older daughters? That is a fascinating, incredibly difficult storyline that ends in a place that I don't think you could get away with today. In a play, because it's ambiguous in a way that I think is like, wow. But eventually it gets around to Eve thinking about, is she going to try and kill her father? And is she going to use voodoo to do it? Because she sees her aunt one time telling a customer to do a certain voodoo thing and questions her about, like, oh, I thought you never used voodoo or anything. And her aunt appears to be cursed because every man she's ever fallen in love with and married has died prematurely. And that happens early in the opening of the movie. Her current husband dies in a car accident. It is a profoundly difficult movie in a way that is so exciting to me, in a way that I wish we were seeing more of in outright genre fiction on a widespread level. The closest movie I can think of to this would be something like Fast Color, which I loved. It's a wonderful, very specific perspective, and it's being tough. It's talking about ideas of family and devotion to family, but is it okay to, be devoted to family if a member of your family is not a good potentially not a good person? Are they not a good person? I don't know. It's a tough movie, and I feel like if it hadn't been written and directed by a Black woman and maybe didn't have these supernatural overtones, it feels like a movie that the Academy would recognize. Like, I think the performances, the tone, the execution of the filmmaking, all of that is super solid and accessible. And, you know, you look up on IMDb and it's just classified as a drama. But if you have interest in genre fiction, I think this would very easily fit in with some of the more like low-key Stephen King stories. And I don't say that lightly. So Eve's Bayou, I think it's one that is asking for some rediscovery, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. And to close things out with our
Comment of the week,
we actually want to kind of highlight everybody's comments, because we had mentioned that last month when we did our theme month of Werewomen, we kind of opened up in the last episode and said that we felt that we didn't really do the best job we could have with the month. And it's the first time we've felt that way, I think, with a theme month.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, something where we expressed a little bit of regret on how we had curated the films for that month, but we were happy to see that you all enjoyed it. That was, you know, that's important to us. Ultimately, the show is for your enjoyment, in addition to ours, but the fact that you all enjoyed it makes us enjoy it more. So thank you for your support. Your support is always wonderful, but it felt really excellent reading it last week. Last week was a tough week.
It really was. And we got comments from pretty much all our loyal listeners and loyal commenters that said, like, they felt that we did a really good job and they're really happy with the month. And that means so much. But we do want to highlight loyal listener and commenter JT, who I think had the best critique. He says, one critique, if I may, would have been having Danielle or some female guests on to discuss Werewomen films from a female perspective. I know you don't have guests on very often, and you regularly come at films from various angles, regardless of its content. You are 100% correct, JT. That is absolutely a failing as part of the month on our part, and we will take that going forward when we do these kind of things and do better, because that is absolutely something that should have been at the forefront of our thoughts when we were coming up with this. And the fact that it wasn't is something that we have to be better about.
Also, just a bit of a heads up for the weeks to come. Judge Dredd was on our schedule to carry out, you know, the end of the month with, but we have taken Judge Dredd off our schedule, considering the crisis that we have with policing in the country today. We thought it would not be appropriate to feature a sort of a dystopian, you know, satirical film about policing in America right now. Not because we fear it would be offensive. We're not afraid of offending ourselves or anybody else just by our choice of the movie. But trouble is, this is a show about movies, and if we were to talk about that movie, there wouldn't really be a whole lot of talking about that movie. It'd be a whole lot of talking about policing in America.
Yeah, so we don't want to say anything at this point and jinx ourselves, but we're trying to do something for the opening spot as far as that's concerned. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll keep you posted. You can always check the schedule page at genrevision.com. But next week, we're going back to Global Gonzo, and I'm so glad we're headed back to this recurring theme episode. And we're going to be doing Beyond the Door, an Italian exorcist ripoff. And this is another one both Travis and I have never seen. I'm very excited. It's recently got a good Blu-ray restoration from Arrow Films. Well,
it's now widely available on VOD. I mean, before it was sort of like a grimy cult movie that was hard to get your hands on. But now Arrow Films has taken it, and you can rent it pretty much anywhere.
So we recommend you rent it and come back next week to talk about Beyond the Door with us. As always, we thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
My name's Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on Genre Vision.